The plains were quiet that evening. The kind of silence that comes after thunder has left its echo behind the hills. The sky still burned with the orange of a dying sun, and the wind carried dust across the wide, empty fields where once wagons used to pass. From that distance, no one would have noticed the lone Apache walking across the prairie, holding something wrapped in faded cloth close to his chest. His steps were slow, not from fear, but from the weight of what he carried, a child whose breath came like whispers of smoke, weak and fading. Every few steps, he pressed his ear to the small chest, as if hoping to hear life again, as if the sound of that breath could lead him to forgiveness. He had been walking since dawn, through canyons, across dry riverbeds, guided only by the memory of an old wooden cabin he once saw when the world was still kind. The baby had been found near a burned wagon, its mother already gone, the father's trail lost in the sand. The Apache did not know why he stopped for the child. Maybe it was because its cry sounded like his own pain. Maybe because the Creator had placed it on his path when he had given up believing in mercy. Either way, the infant was dying, and he was a man with no answers, only the burden of breath too small to keep alive in the desert. When the cabin finally came into sight, half broken and leaning like it had been tired of standing, he thought it was abandoned. Grass had swallowed the fence, and the roof looked as if a storm had torn half its soul away. But then he heard something, a sound, not of wind or animal, but of grief. It came soft at first, like a woman trying not to be heard, then stronger, a cry, torn from the heart. He stopped, his hand tightening around the small body he carried. His people said the spirits of mourning women roamed the plains, but this was no spirit. This was a living cry, a cry that carried pain, loss, and a memory of something gone too soon. He stepped closer, silent as a shadow, and saw her standing near the doorway. Her dress was simple, her hair tangled by wind and tears, and her hands covered her face. The woman was weeping, her knees sinking into the dirt, her voice breaking into the quiet evening. He could not understand her words, but he didn't need to. The sound itself told the story. Someone she loved was gone. Maybe a child, maybe the only reason she had to wake each morning. The Apache hesitated, unsure if to approach or turn back. He was not welcome in this world of settlers and wooden crosses. Yet something deeper than caution pulled him forward. The woman's cry stopped when she saw him. Her eyes widened with fear and disbelief. Before her stood a tall Apache warrior, his skin bronzed by sun, his hair tied with a single feather, a child in his arms. She thought her mind had broken. Her baby had been buried that morning under the old oak, the same tree where her husband had carved their names years ago. She had cried until her throat was dry, prayed until her voice was gone. And now, out of the horizon, came a stranger with a dying infant in his arms, his shadow long and still against the earth. "What do you want?" she whispered, stepping back, her voice trembling between fear and hope. The Apache didn't answer. He only held the child forward, as if offering life itself. She gasped when she saw the small face pale, burning with fever. Eyes fluttering open just enough to reveal a shade of blue that reminded her of her own child. Her heart twisted painfully. Her hands trembled, reaching out and pulling back again, unsure whether she was dreaming or cursed. The man's eyes were steady, filled not with threat but with something heavier, sorrow. He finally spoke in broken English, each word slow and uncertain. "Baby, dying." The woman froze. Those two words carried more truth than she was ready to face. She stepped closer, tears spilling again as she looked at the little one. Her hands, once afraid, now trembled with purpose. She took the child gently, feeling the faint heartbeat, the heat of fever, the way the small fingers tried weakly to grasp air. She turned back toward the Apache, her lips trembling. "Where did you find him?" she asked, but the man didn't answer. He only looked at her, his gaze caught between guilt and silence. For a moment, the world held still. The wind stopped, the grass didn't move, and the sky dimmed into dusk. Two strangers stood before a broken cabin, one who had lost a child, another who carried a dying one. Fate had tied their grief together in ways neither could understand. She looked at him, noticing the way his shoulders carried both strength and exhaustion. The marks of battles fought not just with men, but with his own soul. He looked at her and saw something he hadn't seen in years: mercy. She took the child inside. The Apache followed, ducking under the doorway. The cabin was dim, lit only by a small flame in the corner. Everything smelled of herbs, dust, and sorrow. She laid the baby on the bed and began mixing water with crushed leaves. He watched silently, unsure if she was praying or healing. Her hands moved with trembling skill, her eyes wet but focused. When she pressed the damp cloth on the baby's forehead, the child whimpered softly, a sound that pierced them both. "How long has he been like this?" she asked again, turning to him. He hesitated, then pointed to the horizon. "Since sunup," he said simply. She nodded, understanding that time had almost run out. The Apache stood near the door, his hand resting on the wooden frame. He didn't belong there. Every moment he stayed risked danger. Settlers, soldiers, anyone who saw him would think of blood, not mercy. But leaving felt wrong. The baby's shallow breathing filled the room, mixing with the sound of her whispered prayers. As the night deepened, a storm gathered beyond the plains. The woman covered the child with her shawl and turned toward him. "He needs warmth," she said softly. He looked at the fire, then at his own blanket made from deer hide. Without a word, he placed it over the baby. Their hands touched for the first time, rough skin meeting soft, trembling fingers. Something unspoken passed between them, something fragile but real. The storm outside broke with thunder, shaking the weak walls. Rain began to fall, drumming against the roof, finding its way through cracks and holes. Lightning flashed across the sky, revealing their faces for a moment, her eyes swollen from tears, his from loss. They sat in silence, both waiting, both praying to gods that had long stopped listening. The baby's breathing grew fainter, and the woman began to weep again, her sobs swallowed by the sound of rain. The Apache turned away, his hands clenched. He had seen death before: men, women, children, but this one hurt in a way he couldn't explain. He had carried the child across miles of pain, hoping someone could do what he couldn't. But now, in this lonely cabin, he felt the weight of fate pressing down. He looked at the woman and saw her breaking apart the same way he once did. She was holding the child, whispering lullabies to a life slipping away. And then, just as the thunder rolled again, the baby took a breath, a deep, shaking breath that filled the room. Both of them froze. The child's fingers moved, its eyes fluttered open. For a brief second, hope returned. The woman gasped, covering her mouth, tears of disbelief streaming down. She looked at the Apache, her voice trembling. "He's breathing," she said. The man didn't move. He only stared, as if afraid to believe it. But the moment didn't last. The baby's body tensed, then went still again. The woman's cry broke through the storm, and the Apache turned away, stepping outside into the rain. He stood there, drenched, eyes lifted to the sky, whispering in his native tongue for forgiveness he didn't deserve. Behind him, her voice faded into quiet sobs. The cabin once again, a place of loss. Yet something had changed that night. Two hearts that had been hollowed by grief had found each other. And as the rain washed the dust from the earth, the Apache turned back toward the cabin, knowing he couldn't leave her alone, not yet. There was something left unfinished between them. Something that neither understood, but both could feel: a fragile thread of fate, waiting for dawn to decide what it would become. Rain had washed the land clean by morning. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the sky, pale and heavy, promised another storm before nightfall. Inside the cabin, the woman sat beside the bed, her eyes hollow from crying, her hair still damp from the night before. The baby lay silent now, wrapped in the Apache's deer-hide blanket, its small face peaceful in death. She had held it until her arms went numb. Unable to let go of a life that had not been hers yet, had somehow reopened her broken heart. The Apache stood outside, near the small wooden cross she had built in the early dawn. His dark hair clung to his back, and his bare shoulders glistened in the thin morning light. He had dug the grave himself, using nothing but his hands and a rusted spade he found near the barn. Every handful of dirt felt like penance, every breath heavy with the same question: why had he brought the child here? Maybe fate had played a cruel trick, or maybe the woman's tears in his journey were meant to cross paths for reasons. Neither could yet understand. When the woman finally stepped out, she stopped a few feet behind him. The land was still. Only the wind moved through the grass, whispering across the grave. "You didn't have to bury him," she said quietly, her voice soft but trembling. "He wasn't yours." The Apache didn't turn. "He was no one's now," he replied. "He should not lie alone." His tone was simple, almost emotionless, yet there was something in it that made her chest tighten. She watched him for a moment, realizing he spoke with the weight of a man who had buried too many already. She looked at the tiny grave and whispered, "I lost my child yesterday." He was sick for days. There was nothing I could do. My husband went into town for help but never came back. I buried the boy myself. She turned away, wiping her face with the edge of her sleeve. And then you came, carrying another child to die in my arms. I thought I was cursed. The Apache lowered his gaze. "No curse," he said. "Only pain." He finally faced her then, his dark eyes steady, filled with something that was not pity, but understanding. Pain finds those who still have hearts. She didn't know what to say. For a long moment, they simply stood there, two strangers joined by loss, the grave between them like a shared wound. When she finally spoke again, her tone had changed. "You walked far, didn't you?" He nodded once. "From the dry lands beyond the hills, no water, no shelter. Why?" she asked. He hesitated. The answer was not simple. "Because I had to." She studied him, trying to read the silence between his words. His face carried the roughness of a man who had seen war, who had known hunger and betrayal. Yet there was gentleness in the way he spoke, in the way he stood near the grave as if guarding it. "You can stay here for a while," she finally said. "The land's empty now. My husband. He may not come back." Ain't. The Apache looked at her, uncertain if she meant it or if it was just grief talking. "You trust me?" he asked quietly. She gave a small, weary smile. "I don't trust anyone anymore. But I can't live with ghosts alone either." That day passed slowly. The woman worked around the cabin, fixing what she could, sweeping the floor, lighting the hearth. The Apache helped without being asked, chopping wood or fetching water, mending the broken latch on the door. They spoke little, yet the silence between them no longer felt hostile. When night came, they shared a meal in quiet, sitting across the fire. He ate slowly, unused to such calm. She watched him, wondering what kind of life he had lived before carrying that dying child across the plains. As the flames flickered, she finally asked, "What's your name?" He looked into the fire before answering. "No name that matters here." She frowned slightly. "It matters to me." He was silent for a while, then said, "They call me the one who walks alone." She nodded. "Then that's what I'll call you." Outside, the coyotes howled. The wind scraped against the cabin walls. Neither of them spoke again that night. But in the quiet, something fragile had begun to grow, a shared recognition of survival. Of two hearts that had lost everything yet refused to disappear. Over the next few days, life inside the cabin began to take shape again. The Apache repaired the roof, patched the holes, and built a small corral for the horse she had left behind. She cooked, cleaned, and started tending the small garden behind the barn. They worked side by side, bound by unspoken rhythm, speaking only when needed. The woman began to notice things about him, the way he moved with quiet strength, the way he avoided looking at the sky when thunder rolled, the faint scar near his collarbone that looked like a wound from long ago. One evening, as they sat outside watching the horizon darken, she asked, "Were you a warrior?" He didn't answer right away. "Once," he said finally, "before my people were gone." She turned to him. "Gone, taken," he said softly. "Some killed, some sent away." His voice was calm, but the pain behind it was deep. "The land was ours before your kind came. Now we wander like ghosts." She lowered her eyes. "My husband fought in the war too. He came back different. Angry. He said the world owed him something for all the blood he saw, but it gave him nothing. Just this land that never listens." The Apache glanced at her. "Pain changes men," he said. "Makes them hard. Or hollow." She nodded. "It made me hollow too." Their eyes met for a brief second before she looked away. The connection frightened her, but it also made her feel alive again. Something she hadn't felt since before her child's death. That night, a stranger arrived. The sound of a horse broke the quiet. The Apache was the first to rise, stepping outside with the calm of a man used to danger. A figure on horseback approached slowly, carrying a rifle. The woman followed, heart pounding. When the rider came close enough, she recognized him. Her husband. He looked worn and bitter, his face hardened by weeks on the trail. "Who's that?" he demanded, pointing toward the Apache. His tone was sharp, his eyes filled with suspicion. She stepped forward. "He's been helping here," she said carefully. "The storm he found me when." She stopped, glancing toward the grave. Her husband's gaze followed, and his jaw tightened. "You let him bury our child?" he said coldly. "You let one of them touch our boy?" The Apache said nothing, his expression unreadable. "He carried a dying child here," she said. "He didn't hurt anyone." Her husband dismounted, rage simmering beneath his skin. "I don't care. I want him gone by sunrise." The woman's voice trembled. "He saved me." The man turned on her sharply. "Saved you? From what?" "From loneliness." The silence that followed was heavy. The Apache stood still, his eyes never leaving the husband's face. He could feel the man's hatred, the same kind that had hunted his people across these plains. But he said nothing. When the husband stormed inside, the woman stayed outside a moment longer. "Please," she whispered. "Just stay until morning. I'll speak to him." The Apache nodded once, then turned his gaze to the stars. He knew the look in the husband's eyes, the same look men wore before drawing blood. Something was coming, something that would test both their fates. Inside the cabin, the man paced, anger building like thunder. The woman stood by the window, staring out at the lone figure standing in the dark. Silent, unafraid. By dawn, the air was thick with tension. The husband's hand rested on his rifle. The Apache packed his few belongings, ready to leave. The woman tried to speak, but her voice broke. "You don't have to go," he looked at her gently. "The wind moves on. So must I." But as he stepped toward the door, a shot rang out. The world froze for a breath, and the story of pain and mercy between them took a turn none of them could have foreseen. The gunshot echoed across the valley, scattering a flock of birds into the gray morning sky. The woman froze where she stood, her hands trembling as the sound faded into silence. The Apache staggered back, his shoulder jerking from the force of the bullet, but he did not fall. His hand pressed over the wound, his eyes narrowing as he steadied himself against the wall. The husband stood on the porch, rifle still smoking, breathing hard not from fear, but from something darker, something that had been waiting to escape since the day he lost everything. The woman's voice broke through the heavy air. "No." She ran toward the Apache, kneeling beside him as blood seeped through his fingers. "Why did you do that?" She screamed at her husband. He was leaving. The man spat in the dirt. "I warned him," he said, his voice sharp. "No Apache walks into my home and walks out alive. Not after what they did." The Apache's voice came low, almost calm. I saved your woman." "Don't speak," the man snapped, raising his rifle again. But the woman stepped in front of him, her eyes fierce with something he hadn't seen in her 4 years' defiance. "You'll have to shoot me first," she said. "He saved me when you weren't here. He buried a child you never got to say goodbye to. He deserves better than this." The husband hesitated, the rifle wavering slightly. The storm of guilt and pride in his chest wrestled with the hatred he had carried for years. Finally, he lowered the gun, muttering, "You're blind woman. They're all the same. They kill, they burn, they take." He turned away, his voice shaking. "He'll bring nothing but more death here." The woman looked at the Apache, who was still clutching his wound, his breath shallow but steady. She tore a piece of cloth from her dress and pressed it against the bleeding shoulder. "Stay still," she whispered. "You're not dying here, too." By the time the sun climbed higher, the husband had taken the horse and ridden off toward town. Muttering something about bringing the sheriff, the woman watched him disappear over the hill, her heart heavy with dread. She knew what it meant. The law would not care who fired the gun or why. To them, an Apache bleeding in a settler's home was reason enough to kill. Inside, the Apache sat by the hearth, his skin pale beneath the bronze of sun and wind. She cleaned his wound as best she could, her hand shaking, her mind torn between fear and instinct. "You should run," she whispered. "He'll bring others back." The Apache looked at her, his eyes calm even in pain. "I run, they hunt. I stay, they kill. Same end." "Not if you hide," she said quickly. "There's an old root cellar under the barn. No one's been down there in years. You can stay until I find a way." He hesitated, studying her face. "Why help me?" She paused. The question cut deep. "Because I can't bury another soul," she said softly. He nodded once, silent, and let her lead him outside. The wind had picked up again, carrying the smell of coming rain. She opened the old cellar door behind the barn and helped him down into the shadows. He moved quietly, even wounded, like a man born to vanish. When she closed the door behind him, she stood there for a long moment, her hand pressed against the wood, listening to the faint sound of his breathing below. By afternoon, the husband returned with 2 men from town. Both wore badges, their horses kicking up dust as they approached the cabin. She stepped out before they could reach the door. "Where is he?" One of them asked. "Your husband says you got an Apache hiding here." Her heart pounded, but her face stayed calm. "He's gone," she said. "He left before sunrise. My husband shot him, but he rode off toward the canyons." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "That so?" She nodded. "You can search if you want." The men dismounted and started circling the cabin. The woman stood still, her palms sweating, praying they wouldn't look toward the barn. Her husband watched her closely, suspicion flickering in his eyes. But she met his gaze without fear this time. The sheriff came back after a few minutes. "No tracks," he said. "But if he's wounded, he won't get far." The husband grunted. "Then you better find him before he brings the rest of his kind." When they finally rode off, the woman waited until they were just specks on the horizon. Then she walked to the barn, her heart pounding. She opened the cellar door and whispered, "They're gone." The Apache climbed out slowly, his wound bandaged, his face pale but steady. He looked toward the hills. "They'll come again," he said. She nodded. "I know." He studied her for a moment, then said, "You lied for me." "I told the truth they wouldn't understand," she replied. That night, the wind howled across the plains again. The Apache sat near the fire, sharpening a knife she hadn't seen him carry before. She watched him in silence until she finally spoke. "You've been through this before, haven't you?" He stopped the blade mid-motion. "I've been hunted since I could walk," he said. "For my blood, for land, for being born Apache." She swallowed hard. "And yet you still helped me." He looked at her, the firelight catching the sorrow in his eyes. "Because once, someone helped me when they shouldn't have. A white man. He died for it." She stared at him, realizing for the first time how much of his life was shaped by loss. He wasn't just a man escaping the past. He was carrying the ghosts of it, Outside, thunder rolled again. The husband had gone silent since the sheriff left, sitting by the window, staring out at the darkness. He hadn't spoken a word to her all evening, but his silence was heavier than anger, with suspicion growing like fire in his chest. When she went to check the barn before bed, she found his horse gone. Panic tightened in her throat. She ran back inside. "Where's your horse?" she demanded. He looked at her coldly. "You think I don't know he's still here?" Her heart dropped. "I'm going to finish what I started," he said, reaching for his rifle. She stepped in front of him again, but this time his eyes had no hesitation. "Move," he said. "No," she whispered. For a tense moment, neither moved. Then the sound of a knock came from the back door, soft, deliberate. The husband froze. The knock came again. 3 times. He raised the rifle, moving toward the door. The woman's breath caught as he flung it open. Rain and darkness spilled in, but no one stood there. Only the open plains beyond, endless and empty. Then a shadow moved behind him. In one swift motion, the Apache stepped from the dark corner of the barn, his knife pressed against the man's throat. "Don't." The woman cried out. The husband's eyes widened, the rifle slipping from his hands. The Apache's grip tightened, but he didn't strike. He looked at her instead, breathing hard. "He will kill again," he said quietly. "That's what hate does." The woman stepped closer, her voice shaking. "Then let me stop it. Not you." For a long, breathless moment, the world stood still, the storm raging outside, the fire crackling inside, and 3 souls trapped between vengeance and mercy. The Apache slowly lowered his knife and stepped back. The husband stumbled away, clutching his neck. Humiliated but alive, the woman turned toward the Apache, tears welling in her eyes. "You can't stay now," she said, her voice breaking. "He'll never stop." The Apache nodded, picking up his blanket and his knife. "The storm will hide my trail," he said softly. "But when it clears, you'll see smoke on the horizon. That will be my answer." She didn't understand what he meant, but she didn't ask. She only watched as he stepped into the rain, vanishing into the darkness once more. The husband stood by the door, silent and trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what he had become. The storm raged until dawn, and by the time the light returned, the plains were still again. But far in the distance, a thin line of smoke rose against the morning sky, curling upward like a promise, or a warning that their story was far from over. The sky had turned the color of steel by noon, the kind that warned of another storm coming across the prairie. The wind carried the smell of wet dust and fear. Inside the cabin, silence hung like a heavy curtain. The woman sat at the edge of the table, her hands trembling around a cold cup of coffee. The husband paced near the door, his boots scraping against the wooden floor, while his rifle leaned against the wall within reach. His eyes were restless, scanning the horizon through the window again and again, as if expecting the Apache to rise out of the grass like a ghost, far beyond the hills. Thin trails of smoke twisted into the gray sky. The woman saw them first. She stood slowly, her heart thudding against her ribs. "There," she whispered, pointing. The husband followed her gaze, his expression turning grim. "I told you he'd come back," he said under his breath. "That smoke means others. He's brought his kind." She shook her head, her voice weak but certain. "He wouldn't. He's not like that." The man turned on her sharply. "You don't know him? You only know what you want to see." He grabbed his rifle, loading it with quick, angry hands. "If they come, we won't live to see another sunrise." The woman's throat tightened. The tension in the air was unbearable, each second heavier than the last. "You're wrong," she said, but her voice trembled. She wanted to believe her own words, but even she couldn't explain the meaning of that smoke rising in the distance. By nightfall, the wind had grown fierce. The barn creaked, the shutters banged against the windows, and the sky turned black. The woman tried to light the lamp, but her hands shook too much to steady the match. The husband took it from her, muttering curses under his breath. When the flame finally caught, its flicker revealed the fear etched deep in both their faces. Outside, something moved. It was faint at first, a shadow against the rain, the soft thud of hooves in the mud. The husband froze. "They're here," he whispered. He blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The woman's breath caught as they both crouched near the window. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, she saw figures beyond the fence, 3 of them, tall, silent, unmoving. The husband raised the rifle and aimed, but she grabbed his arm. "Wait," she hissed. "It might be him." Shook her off. "If it is, then I'll make sure he never comes near this house again." Before he could pull the trigger, a voice cut through the rain low, steady and unmistakable. "I come alone." The woman's heart leaped. She rushed to the door before her husband could stop her. When she opened it, the storm almost knocked her back. Standing at the edge of the porch was the Apache, drenched, his long hair plastered to his back. His wound was healed, but his eyes carried something darker at urgency. Behind him, 2 horses waited, restless in the rain. "You shouldn't be here," she said, shouting over the wind. He stepped closer, his face unreadable. "Riders come from the south. Soldiers, they think I killed a child." "Your man told them." The husband appeared behind her, rifle raised again. "You should have kept riding," he said. "Now they'll take you, and maybe her too." The Apache's gaze didn't move from the woman. "You must leave. Both of you." "Why?" she asked. "Because when they come, they burn what they find." For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the rain and thunder filled the silence. The husband lowered the gun slightly, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "How far?" he asked. "An hour. Maybe less." The woman turned to her husband. "We have to go," clenched his jaw, torn between pride and survival. "And leave everything." "There's nothing left worth dying for," she said quietly. But even as she spoke, they heard the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing through the valley. The Apache turned toward the sound, his muscles tense. "Too late," he said. "They're here." He moved toward his horse, pulling a bow from its saddle. "They come for me. I'll lead them away." "No," she said, grabbing his arm. "They'll kill you." His eyes softened for a brief second. "Better me than you." The husband stepped forward. "You brought this on us. Don't act like a hero now." The Apache's gaze flicked to him, sharp and cold. "I brought you warning. What you do with it is your choice." Then he mounted the horse in one smooth motion. Lightning split the sky, illuminating his figure against the storm. He turned once toward the woman, his face half hidden by rain and shadow. "Stay low. Keep inside until dawn." Before she could answer, he was gone, vanishing into the darkness. The husband shut the door and bolted it. The woman sank into the chair, trembling. The thunder outside mixed with the pounding of her heart. The man paced the room, his grip tightening on the rifle. "You still think he's saving us?" he said bitterly. "He's leading them here." "No," she whispered. "He's leading them away." But her voice lacked conviction now. Hours passed. The wind howled across the plains, carrying the faint sound of gunfire in the distance. The husband went to the window, his eyes narrowing. "They're fighting," he muttered. "He's out there buying his time." The woman stood beside him, clutching the edge of the window frame. Every flash of lightning lit the horizon silhouettes of horses, smoked the chaos of men chasing one another through the storm. Her breath caught each time the thunder roared, imagining the Apache among them. Alone against an army, when the gunfire stopped, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. The husband stepped back, uneasy. "If he's dead, they'll come here next." She turned to him, her voice trembling. "Then we'll tell them he never came back. You think they'll believe that?" He gave a harsh laugh. "They'll see the tracks. They'll see my blood on the ground. No, they'll hang me too." She looked at him, then really looked tanned for the first time, saw the cracks in him clearly. The man she once loved had been eaten alive by fear and pride. "Maybe that's what you fear most," she said quietly. "Not dying, but facing what you did." He glared at her, his face twisting. "Don't you start." The wind rattled the window again, and the lamp flickered. Then, from outside came a sound that froze them both, single horses, neigh, faint but close. The woman's eyes widened. She ran to the door, but the husband blocked her path. "No," he said. "You open that door and we both die." She shoved him aside and unlatched it anyway. The rain poured in, cold and heavy. A horse stood near the fence, riderless, its flanks streaked with mud and blood. The woman stepped forward, calling out into the dark. "Where are you?" No answer. Only thunder rolling across the valley. She turned back, her face pale. "He's still out there." The husband grabbed her arm. "Get inside." But she pulled free. "I'm not hiding anymore." She took a lantern and ran toward the barn, her skirt heavy with rain, her heart pounding louder than the storm. Inside, the air smelled of hay and smoke. She lifted the lantern high, calling his name again. Then she saw it, a shadow moving behind the stalls. The Apache stepped forward, drenched, his body covered in cuts and dirt, his eyes burning with exhaustion. She dropped the lantern in relief. "You're alive," she whispered. He leaned against the beam, breathing hard. "Not for long. They followed me to the ridge. I led them away, but they'll come here at dawn." She tried to steady her voice. "Then we run." He shook his head. "They'll find you. You can't outrun soldiers? Then we fight." He looked at her, the corner of his mouth lifting faintly. "You talk like one of us now," before she could answer. Footsteps crunched outside heavy boots, more than one set. The woman's breath caught. "They're here," she whispered. The Apache straightened, his hand on his knife. "Hide," he said. "No," she replied. "Not this time." The door burst open, and the lantern light flickered across the faces of armed men, their uniforms dark with rain. The husband stood among them, his rifle lowered, but his eyes empty. The sheriff stepped forward, his voice cold. "Step away from the woman." The Apache didn't move. His eyes flicked to her once, calm, steady, full of something that felt like farewell. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. The sheriff cocked his gun. Now, the Apache exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening on the blade. The woman stepped forward, her arms outstretched. "Don't shoot." The storm outside broke in a roar of thunder, drowning her voice, and for one suspended second, the world hung between mercy and violence. The rain poured harder, the wind howled through the broken barn walls, and everyone knew that when the next sound came, it would change everything. "You said, continue from where the climax left off and write." 1,200 words wrapping up the story. This part should provide a satisfying resolution, answer any remaining questions, and conclude subplots. Leave the audience with key takeaways or reflections, making the ending memorable and engaging. Naturally, include keywords to keep the SEO optimization strong. End the story now in natural way. Also, do not make any headings. Only write story in paragraphs. Also, keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also, make the script human-centric and don't give feel of AI generated. Also, don't create violated content which can affect YouTube policy. AI sees the ellipsis as 3 dots. So, it reads it as ... That's why I do not use 3 or 2 dots. Collectively, GOT ChatGPT said. The thunder rolled far into the hills, fading slowly as the rain began to ease. For a moment, no one moved. The sheriff's hand trembled on the gun. The woman stood frozen mid-step. The Apache stood tall in the center of the barn, rainwater dripping down his chest, his breath sharp but steady. The echo of the last gunshot hung in the air like a memory that refused to die. No one had fallen yet, though everyone knew how close it had come. The horses snorted in fear, smell of gunpowder mixing with wet hay. The woman's voice broke first, hoarse and desperate. "No one's dead," she said softly. "It doesn't have to end like this." The sheriff didn't answer. He kept his weapon aimed, his jaw tight, eyes darting between her and the Apache. "He's wanted," the sheriff said coldly. "For killings down south, a wagon raid near the border, 6 dead." The woman shook her head. "That's a lie." The Apache's voice was quiet but firm. "I was there, but I did not kill. I found the bodies. The soldiers came after," the sheriff sneered. "And you expect me to believe that?" The husband finally spoke, stepping forward, his face pale and drawn. "It's true," he said. "He didn't kill them." "I did." The room went still. Even the horses stopped moving. The woman turned to him, disbelief flooding her eyes. "What are you saying?" He lowered his rifle, his hands shaking. "That night," he muttered, "the border camp. I was with the scouts. We found a wagon, thought it was carrying stolen guns. When we fired, we didn't see the women inside until it was too late. The army said it was Apache work, so we burned their bodies and blamed it on his kind. It was easier that way." The sheriff's face hardened. "You're lying." But the man kept talking, his voice hollow. Maybe I should have stayed quiet. But he saved her life, and I had." He stopped, his throat tightening. "I'm tired of lies." The sheriff looked at the Apache again. For a long moment, the tension balanced on the edge of violence. Then the sheriff lowered his gun slightly, uncertainty in his eyes. "You've got one chance," he said. "Leave before sunrise. If I see you again, I'll finish the job." The Apache gave a slow nod. He turned to the woman, his eyes dark with something unspoken. "Take care of your heart," he said softly. "It carries too much pain." She stepped closer, rain still dripping from her hair. "You can't go alone," she whispered. "They'll hunt you." He gave a faint, sad smile. "They've hunted me my whole life." And with that, he slipped out into the dawn. The sheriff holstered his gun and followed the husband outside, warning him that if he left the county, he'd answer for the killings. The woman stood there, staring at the empty doorway. The last image of the Apache burned into her mind, the rain on his shoulders, the quiet strength in his eyes, the weight of everything that could never be spoken between them. By mid-morning, the storm had passed. The world smelled of damp earth and smoke. The woman walked to the small hill behind the cabin, where two graves now lay side by side, the child's, and the one belonging to her lost faith in what life had been before. She sat there quietly, tracing her fingers along the wooden cross, her thoughts drifting between sorrow and gratitude. Days passed. The sheriff never came back. The husband grew silent, spending long hours out in the fields, rebuilding fences that the wind had knocked down. The woman tried to forgive him, but the words wouldn't come. He had betrayed more than trust. He had destroyed the fragile line between love and hate one morning. She woke to find the horse gone and his clothes missing. No note, no goodbye. Only footprints leading south toward the same horizon where the Apache had vanished. She stood on the porch, staring into the distance, feeling both loss and relief. Perhaps he went to face his sins, or perhaps he went chasing the ghost of the man he used to be. She didn't know, and she didn't ask. Weeks later, she found something strange near the riverbank, a strip of deer hide tied around a stone, carved with a single mark. It was the sign of the Apache. Her hands trembled as she turned it over and saw another carving beneath it, the symbol for peace. She looked up at the sky, feeling a sudden stillness inside her chest. Somewhere out there, he was alive. And in that knowledge, she felt a small, quiet hope. Life slowly returned to the plains. The rains brought new grass, the trees began to bud again. And the sound of the wind through the valley no longer carried sorrow. The woman rebuilt the garden, repaired the broken roof, and planted wildflowers around the graves. Sometimes in the evenings, she would sit on the porch, her hands folded in her lap, watching the sunset paint the land in gold. She often thought about the Apache. She wondered where he had gone, whether he had found peace or just another place to run. But she also thought about what he had given her, not just safety, but the courage to face truth, even when it hurt. He had come into her life carrying a dying child and left her with something that lived far longer than pain. The will to begin again as the years passed. Stories spread among nearby towns of a lone Apache who wandered the desert helping those stranded or lost. Some said he was a spirit, others a man who refused to die. She never corrected them. She knew the truth was somewhere between both. One spring morning, long after the memory of that storm had faded from most minds, she heard a familiar sound outside, horses' soft steps near the barn. Her heart jumped. She stepped onto the porch, but the yard was empty. Only a single feather lay on the ground, black and worn. She picked it up, holding it close, a smile breaking through tears. It was his way of saying goodbye, or perhaps a promise that he was still watching over her from wherever the road had taken him. That evening, she sat by the fire, the feather resting on the mantel beside a small wooden carving she had made of a child's hand. The wind outside was gentle now, whispering through the grass like a song half remembered. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the fire wash over her, feeling, for the first time in years, that she was no longer alone. The plains carried on, endless and quiet, filled with both loss and renewal. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, a lone Apache rode through the dusk, the sun burning behind him, his shadow stretching long over the land that had once broken him and now kept his story alive. His past no longer hunted him, followed him softly like the wind, like the memory of a woman who had seen beyond his scars. As darkness fell, the world settled into peace again. The woman's candle flickered in the window, a faint glow against the vast night, as if guiding the lost toward home. The child's grave rested beneath the stars, the flowers swaying gently in the wind, and the sound of the river whispered like an old prayer carried on the breeze. Their lives had been bound by grief and mercy, by choices made in pain, and by the fragile courage to forgive what could not be changed. And though the plains would forget their names, the land itself would remember the cabin, the storm, and the day an Apache arrived with a dying baby and found instead a woman who taught him that even the most broken souls could still find grace beneath an open sky.